So we're going to get started. So my name is Avineri. I teach at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about cultivating praxis for justice. And in particular, we're going to focus on a methodology that I've been working on called paying attention to the tension to set intention. So to give you an overview of the presentation, the first piece is that we're going to set some community agreements for our time together and do a little bit of a reflection with some orienting questions that you'll see in a moment. I'll give some definitions for praxis and social justice and share with you the framework, the applied linguistic anthropology framework, and some particular examples of language and social justice issues, or LSJIs. And then we'll look at this methodology of attention, tension, intention, before we look a little bit about how you can maybe explore these methodologies for your own practice. All right. So I wanted to first share some community agreements. I'm curious how many of you use things like this in your courses, where you kind of share guidelines of how to be accountable to one another in your classroom spaces. This was adapted from some students who were working on this, the Middlebury Institute Symposium on World Languages Education. And if you don't mind, just take a minute or two to kind of read through them, and we'll react or have some thoughts or responses to each of them. So just take a moment or two to read them through, and then we'll discuss. So if I could invite just any reactions to any of the components or things you want to explore, ask questions about, would anybody be willing to share just one or two that you appreciate or one that you want to explore further? Yes?
I wanted to ask something, and this might be because of not being a native speaker. What is the difference between calling people in versus calling people? I mean, I know calling people out,
sure,
but I don't really know calling people in.
Yeah, thanks. So it's actually, sure, yeah. Those phrasal verbs will get us every time. So I think the way that I've heard it talked about, the way that I understand it, is that a lot of times if we're trying to create a space of dialogue in our classrooms and we're trying to kind of surface different perspectives among our students, and maybe there's a student who says something that, maybe everybody doesn't agree with, or they're not really sure how to engage with it. So that student, in a way, kind of becomes othered, either explicitly or implicitly, because they're kind of called out, as opposed to calling people in, which is more of like, I'm curious, can you share more about your perspective? I'm trying to understand that more deeply. And it creates a different kind of inclusive community, I think, to say we're all in this together, even if I might challenge or not necessarily be on board with what you have to say. So it's more about creating that inclusive dialogic space, I think.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
If that helps, yeah. Other reactions to any of the components, things, yeah.
So, I was thinking when at the point that says challenge an idea, not the person.
Yes.
I remember that with my colleagues, we've been reading with our students to establish community agreements, the 4 agreements by Miguel Ruiz, the Toltec wisdom, which is precisely one of the agreements among humans to have an open discussion.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, and I love there's so many intertextual connections, I'm sure, to different components that you've all worked with. But I think, yeah, that idea that, if we're going to really engage around a topic or an issue, that it's not going to become personal. Though many things are personal, right? We have a personal positionality in relation to them, but if we're trying to create dialogic spaces, it's more about that engagement. Yeah. Other reactions, questions, appreciations about the community agreements? Anything else? My favorite, again, this isn't mine, it's from my students, but is the why, bless you, why am I talking, why aren't I talking? I like that a lot, because if everybody is doing that in a classroom space all the time, and you realize, I keep on wanting to raise my hand, or I'm being quiet, I wonder why, that it isn't necessarily saying you must speak if you don't want to, or that if you're quiet, you have to say something. But if everybody has that reflective orientation, then it creates a different kind of environment, I've found. So I like that one a lot. Yes?
Also, just thinking as a language educator, if you're working in a second language classroom, there are lots of opportunities to address linguistic features such as catching, but also degrees of severity within the way you express yourself, but then also as practically as practicing I statements and what that means and how that functions in whatever language you're teaching, because that also varies across multiple languages.
Absolutely. Yeah, so also the cultural frames that might be implied in all of these, but also how do we create sentence starters or other kinds of scaffolding for this kind of engagement. Yes, thank you.
I also like the kindness for yourself aspect, because sometimes, you butcher yourself when, especially you reflect on what you've said or done after you've said it or done it, like, oh, I should have done this, differently. So I think showing also kindness for yourself, this is also a learning experience for you, so it's okay if you make a mistake, you learn from it.
Right.
It's very important. It's an important reminder. So like that.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well, that yes, we're trying to create a collective dialogic space, which is relational, and also we want to recognize we're individuals in this space, and so we may say something we didn't mean to say, or that we go back and think about it more deeply, so I appreciate that. So I'm just curious, how do we feel about, for our 23 minutes together, if are we comfortable with these being our community agreements? Yes? We could literally spend the entire day talking just about this, but as a little microcosm for what we're trying to do. So thank you for your reactions and your responses and your deepening. So if you don't mind, many of you have a piece of paper on your table, and if you have the notebook or what have you from Circle. So I'm going to ask you to take a couple of minutes. These are just for yourself. You're not going to be sharing them out with anybody else at your tables. This is purely for you to orient yourself to this time. And also hopefully just, we're going to have a lot of sessions today. We've already been exposed to amazing, ways of thinking and frameworks from the plenary speakers. So just to take a moment or two, individually reflect, who am I? What do I believe? Where is my context? So at all scales, when we think about the places that we teach and that we work and that we live, and if I think we all can think about this at different scales, so the macro, the big picture, the meso or institutional context, the micro, the more interpersonal, and what I call the micro, which is the individual. So thinking about who are we, in that context. What are my goals, either for today, for the conference, for your own work? Who are my trusted peers, and what can I do? Okay, so these are, again, super deep questions, but if you can take a moment now to just respond or interpret the questions, and then we'll move into the content. Be another minute. All right, so we're going to bring it back to the group just to get a sense. Were you able to at least write down your response to a couple of the questions, or at least think a little bit about them? Yeah? Okay, great. So it'll help frame what's coming. All right, so just some kind of definitions, since the session is about praxis and about justice. At our core, we're talking about this notion of reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. So this iterative cycle of theory, reflection, and action, and how those are interconnected one with the other in order to move toward a social world that we are comfortable with and aspiring towards. So that's our first kind of basic definition around praxis. And then we have social justice. Now, there are plenty of frameworks, ways of thinking about social justice. These are the ones that I really draw upon deeply in my own work and my collaborations with others. So the first is this notion that social justice is both relational and aspirational, so that constantly we're trying to deepen, reimagine, redistribute power dynamics in society and with one another, and that we're building those relationships in the service of an aspiration towards a reimagination of our world. This also, I love Bell's idea of social justice being both a process and a goal. So it's something that we're building towards, and it's also the way that we get there. Okay, so it also relates to this notion of relationality. And that, as we heard in the plenary and also yesterday in plenty of sessions, this idea of historicizing. So understanding legacies of oppression, consciousness raising and collaboration, with the goals of full participation, equitable resource distribution, and access to opportunities. 𝘾𝙪𝙡𝙯 has a lot of really useful ways of thinking about human rights, human resources, opportunities, and also when we think about languages, groups, cultures, in terms of respect, representation, and recognition. And my colleagues and I, a few years ago, we were really focused on 5 components, focused on language and social justice, in particular, language access, equity, power, privilege, and marginalization. So these are just some beginning ways to think about social justice. And in my colleagues in my recent book, we have these 5 iterative steps of how to build towards a language and social justice. So this is the Applied Linguistic Anthropology framework, the ALA framework. And what we're really thinking about is how is language implicated in social justice issues in the world? How are they interrelated one with the other? And how are we uniquely positioned to recognize and deepen our understanding of language's relevance in social justice topics? So our first step is to identify what we call an LSJI, so a language and social justice issue. I'll give some examples on the next slide. And so we're thinking about like climate change and then centering language in relation to that, right? Poverty, how do we think about language in relation to that? So any social justice issue in the world, what is the role of language within that? And then centering language. So what is the collective lexicon what are the terms of agreement that we need in order to, what do we mean by equity as it relates to language reclamation? What do we mean by access when we talk about healthcare interpreting, right? So we really want to understand, operationalize those terms, and use language to understand the role of language in the world. The next piece would be what is. Okay, so our framework is about what is, what has been, and what could be. So before we can build and aspire towards a new world, we have to really deeply understand what we see and what created the structures of power that are observable now. So we have the what is, has multiple pieces to it. So reflection, noticing, observation, narrative, and a huge component of it is recognizing both our positionalities and our commitments. So with my students, I'll talk a lot about, let's say you care deeply about immigration, but you're not yourself an immigrant, right? Versus if you care deeply about immigration and you come from an immigrant family, right? How do those create different kinds of dynamics in terms of the advocacy work that you might have in mind? So really thinking about positionality and commitment, and then not just observing what we see and describing it, but then recognizing that there are things to critique, right? Or ask questions about or to be critical of. And then to really think about what has been. So what are the structures historically that have brought us to this, what we can observe today? So deepening our reflection, noticing, observation, narrative, positionalizing commitments and critique, and moving more to the institutional and the structural issues. Doing those steps very deeply in collaboration with others before we move into the what could be. Okay, so the relations, the aspirations, and the actions. And with my students, we talk a lot about the distinctions among awareness raising, advocacy, and activism. So how are those interconnected but distinct, actually, in terms of methodologies for building a new world? So these are just some of the examples that we talk about in the book. And our book is focused on North America, though the framework could be used in other contexts for sure, but you'll see a number of examples here. US Census language categories, gendered language, environmental justice, interpreting, media coverage, and I'm sure you could think of many, many others. And we look at each of these as case studies of LSJI, so how language and social justice are interrelated. And a really important component of the framework is both representation and recognition. So how we use language to engage with and describe the world, and also recognizing language speakers or groups who do and do not have power. A large component of what we're focused on also is that language change alone is insufficient for social change. So it isn't just that if we call something different, that will automatically mean that the structures have shifted, right? So a huge component is actually looking at these interconnected in an interconnected way. And I'll very quickly this is one of the reflections that we have students do or that we encourage educators to do, is select an LSJI that matters to you, and then really think more deeply about the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how as it relates to that topic. So, and we're building on lots and lots of scholars who have done work in this area. So yeah, these are some case studies we looked at more deeply. And so the methodology that I just wanted to share is this attention to the tension to set intention, okay? Now, raise your hand if you teach languages. That's kind of your okay. How many of you teach intercultural courses? Okay, how many of you train or work with teachers? You do work with educators, okay. So in all of your work, do tensions come up?
Never.
Now they could be, good you weren't microphone yet. Yeah. So I mean, I think a really important point that we want to recognize is that these tensions are coming up constantly, whether we surface them or not. They're internal, right? They might be interpersonal. They might be that we notice something in the world, but we can't do anything about it, or we feel like we can't do anything about it. That creates all kinds of tension. We're observing tension and conflict in the world, right? And so it's all of these different layers simultaneously. And so my students, at some point, they get sick of hearing me say, well, let's pay attention to the tension. Like, it's so integrated into everything. Again, that's it, yeah. So this is one example of a reflection that I have students do. So where they think about an intercultural interaction, they surface the tensions. Now, the way that we talk about tension is they're push-pull, okay? Something's taking you in two or more directions, and you have to name those directions, okay? And so we then sort of deepen and think about what knowledge, skills, dispositions can you offer for engaging with those tensions, and what kind of change could emerge, whether it's macro, meso, micro, or micro scale, okay? And we iterate on this. Lesson planning, right? Working in a classroom, working with an individual student, right? Any of those different scales. And it becomes very, very generative. And it acknowledges that though tension can, of course, be negative, if we have the orientation that it has the potential to be productive, then there's a lot more that can be explored and deepened. So get ready for a last slide that has a lot of material on it. So, okay. Okay, so in addition to the work that I do with students, when we think about our own work as educators, there's plenty of tensions that we feel, right, as we're facilitating these engagements, right? So one is that this tension between objectivity and subjectivity, right? And we heard in the plenary about biases, neutrality. Is that a goal? Why or why not, right? So recognizing that and exploring it with our colleagues and with ourselves. Our institutional positionality and our individual identities, right? That's another tension that we can explore around who am I in relation to what I'm being asked to do, what I have the structural ability to make happen, etc. Anytime that we're talking about something like, I don't know, sports team mascot names, right? There's going to be complexity, right? It's not just a simple, straightforward, clear answer when we're talking about these issues. And so that tension between complexity and let's say, either clarity or simplicity. A really big tension that my students and I feel is that there's so many social justice issues that are so urgent, and yet the framework is asking them to deepen their understanding of what is and what has been, right? So you can't fast forward to what could be in the framework, and so that tension between we have to get these things done and also understand them like ethnographers, right? And then advocating for issues and being or not being part of the group being impacted, our own curricular structures and student agency, building community proactively, as we did for a moment at the beginning, versus responsive relationship repair, and also learning content knowledge, but also cultivating community. So I think I raised these tensions. I'm sure we all could think of plenty more if we had more time together, that we then could think through how do we manage these, how do we work within these within our own structures. And I know I just have a moment to wrap up. This is a reflection. I encourage you. The PowerPoint's in the app, so you're welcome to use it in whatever ways you choose. But you know, now what, right? who do you want to be? With whom do you want to learn? What are you learning today that can connect with your professional practice? Why do certain ideas, frameworks, activities resonate with you? How will you move forward? And the last thing that I'll mention here is for many of us, when we're thinking about these different issues or tensions, they kind of come up at particular scales, right? So when I have more time to work with educators, we workshop these and we surface like most of my focus is on the micro scale, right? Or most of my focus is on the macro scale, and then what are the strategies we can mobilize in collaboration with other people to address these scales in the service of justice. And at the very end, you'll see it in the app if you have the PowerPoint, I have some other, I'm not gonna go through them, but some other activities that you can use that are also in the book that help us understand both the LSJIs, but also help us think more deeply about the role of tension in our work. So I think I will wrap up there, but thank you, everybody.